So I want to start off by talking a little bit about sampling. So a little while ago, we published a report that was advising Nectar customers about best practices. And one of the things that we focused on was how even sampling 5% of hives and doing it on a randomized basis can generate really meaningful data as opposed to the sort of common practices around sampling. Can you tell us a little bit about why that is and how you came to those conclusions?
Yes, so it's actually a very interesting question because it's actually a fundamental of statistic, and it's a story about a brewery, the Guinness Brewery, and they were actually trying to optimize like the barley production to find like the most optimal barley to produce more beer, right? And they realized they couldn't in any way sample enough like all the barley they produce and like to quantify the performance. So they hired a statistician, and basically what he realized is that if he took only a portion of the population, so the barley is like there's different barley of different type, we're not going to sample everything. We're going to go and we're going to sample a proportion of each crop. And with that information, he realized he was able to generalize and actually represent really well the full population. So from then, they were able to speed up a lot the selecting process of barley, and they come up with a much more optimized barley. So now, about 100 years later, when I get asked that question, I'm like, it's based on this fundamental statistic, right? Which we can benefit in beekeeping the same way. So rather than barley, we can sample hive, right?
So let's take that back to sampling then. So that 5% number, if the intention of sampling is to get a sense of the health of our hives or the number of frames of bees across our hives, why and how does 5% make sense?
In commercial beekeeping, often beekeeper will try to equalize their hive as much as possible because it eases the management. It makes everything better. If the hive are more equal, I can operate more easily. So for that reason, in beekeeping, if we sample 5 to 10% of a yard, we will represent well the grading. While if you try to cut corners and say, I'm just gonna go at the yard and run a yard report, and I'm gonna count the number of weak, medium, and strong, for example. And that could be valuable from a logistic perspective. You would know quickly, like which yard contain more strong, more weak. But you would lose everything else because it's not linked to a specific hive. So no growth, no change in time. So you're not able to assess the impact of what you do because you don't actually know which hive became weak to medium or medium to strong. And really, you could gain way more benefit by investing just a little bit more time because, as I said, you don't need to do it 100%. So if you adopt a 5% strategy, you would get the logistic benefit because rather than seeing 10 weak, 10 medium, 10 strong, I would know that that yard is 9.5 frame of bees on average with a spread of 3, which is way more informative and accurate than 10, 10, 10. And then if I repeat that, then I would grade the same hive through time. And now I could get growth. So I could see the impact of my work on the hive and I could optimize that.
So you're saying that a lot of beekeepers, when they're trying to get a sense of the health of their hives, they'll go around the yard, grade their hives based on weak, medium, and strong. And instead of tying back any of the information back to an individual hive, they'll do so at the yard level. And so they'll be like, oh, there's 40 hives in this yard. We've got 30 strong, 8 medium, and 2 weak. And what you're saying is, while that information seems like it might give you good information, because it's not traceable back to the individual hives, it actually will give you better insights across the entire operation if you were to go to that 40 hive yard and instead inspect 4 or 5 hives with granular details on frames of bees and queen right, other kinds of information. Is that right?
Totally. Because what people might not see is that behind weak, medium, and strong are hidden distribution, So the same principle that we just applied to the yard. So if I have an average, I can represent well my population of the yard, right? But if I tell to my workers anything between 3 and 6 is a week, right? So there's a spread of 3 here. And we know that workers don't grade the same way. Sadly, we're all humans. So add a spread of 2 on top of that because, like let's be optimistic on that variance between how people grade. So that actually means that like it's anywhere between 1 and 8 every week you enter, and that will change through time, and you're not able to judge that because anything is not reported to the specific hive. So actually, when you see 10 week, it's possible that 4 of them or 5 are misclassified medium. So that information might seem appealing or easy to capture, but actually you're adding too much noise. So it's actually like you're relying on an inaccurate complete count rather than relying on an accurate incomplete count.
And so one of the things that was mentioned in that report was that a way to get around this, or at least one of the best practices, is to do random hive sampling. So in that scenario where you show up at the yard and you're picking 5 hives to inspect more closely, it's best to do that randomly to make those
So
choices. Am I understanding that correctly?
totally, because if you always do the same hive, then you'll basically you'll bias your vision. So you'll get more and more accurate on less and less hive. Rather than if you randomly pick hive, then you'll sample different individuals, so different hive out of the population of so the hive in the yard. And like this, you'll represent better at all time the full distribution, right? Which can like some hive can change more dramatically than others, for example. So you would get that by randomly sampling, but you wouldn't if you always did the same, right? So
Interesting. And so, okay, so I want to now mention something, a big change to the technology of sampling as a whole. And that's a product you've been working on very, very closely, which is Meli and audio-based sampling. Now that we have this tool, something that it's not perfect, but it's getting pretty darn close. We're seeing around 90% accuracy, 88% accuracy or more, and with the expectation that it's going to get a lot better. If before we were in a scenario where, coming back to that yard of 40 hives, it made the most sense to look at 5 or 6 of them. Now we have a tool that instead of doing an alcohol wash, which might take 15 minutes, might obstruct the hive, you might kill queen, there's all sort of negative side effects of opening the hive. We're in a scenario where we have an unobtrusive technology that in 15 seconds can get a really solid reading. How does that approach the way that beekeepers should and can approach sampling?
yeah, so that's why I said it with the current method earlier, but you could if you could speed up grading, then you could acquire more data point in less time. So it opens up a lot of doors because like a lot of the problem in beekeeping and why people won't collect data is just time. It's just that there's so much to do. Like, and then it's a big investment to decide, oh, I'm not gonna make more queen. I'm gonna collect data. You know, like it can seems like at the moment it seems like a bad decision, even if it probably not. But if you could get both, if you could without affecting too much your day to day, you could e- elevate your accuracy in real time about what's going on in your operation, or not in real time, but almost real time, because you could repeat it more often. This is where it changed the game because there's data points we could not even acquire. For example, mite level, like you're not going to do that in your busy season, and so people will do it often in spring and fall because they want to treat the hive. So we have no idea of the mite dynamic the rest of the season, and you could have taken action at those moments if you knew your mite level in July, for example, which nobody do, or almost nobody. That would have yield much higher benefit for you in the long run, right? So not only now, when you want to sample for grading, you get a side effect, and those side effects will grow. So your intent is grading a hive, but you'll know also an index of the queen presence and the mite level. And soon we can extend that to more. So by collecting one data point, you collect more data point.
You're about to publish a new sort of report slash blog post, and one of the sections focuses on the problems with alcohol washes. Can you give me just a quick synopsis on what that research suggests?
Yes, it's interesting. So it's all related to what I just described, right? You need to be aware of like of what actually am I sampling, and I think like alcohol washes it has been seen for at least 10 years as the gold standard to know mite level, right? But it's actually interesting because alcohol wash is a great method to assess phoretic mites. So beekeepers, I'm sure you are aware, but like there's the mite have two stages. So there's one stage in the brood, and there's one stage that they feed on the adult bee and use them to transport, which basically phoretic means that it's an animal that use an animal to move. And the thing is that 90% of the population of mite is in the brood as soon as there is brood, and you need to sample in moment of the season that there is brood, because if you sample when there's no brood, it's often too late. Basically, the virus has done its job, the mite level are already too high, and the bees that you want to live long for the winter are already affected. So you cannot wait a broodless colony. You could simulate it, you could cage the queen, but that's a lot of manipulation, and that's not really realistic in commercial beekeeping. So alcohol wash gives you at maximum like a representation of the mite level in your colony of 10%, because 90% of the mite is in the brood. But that's like the first part of it. But the second problem is that those wash, like, you need to respect exactly what's the method of it, and that method can fluctuate a lot from one worker to another. It not bad intent, just like people are different and see things differently. And like the research that show that even if you do it perfectly, and you shake for 90 seconds, the nurse bees that you pick perfectly and everything, you'll detach not between 65 and 90% on the mite within that sample. So now, like, you took 300 bees from a population which is unknown, right? So 300 of maybe 30,000, maybe 3,000, it's not the same thing. Then on those 300 bees, you shake off the mite, but let's say you're a really good shaker, so you get 90% of them, and you were sampling only 10% of the mite population. So now you're at 9%, like you're 90% of 10%, right? So your best shot at detecting your mite population is 9%. And now, like, this takes you a long time. You need to get to the brood. You need to shake those bees, let those bees fly so the foraging bee goes away. Take those bees, put them in alcohol, shake them for 2 minutes ish, and then try to count them like in this little thing in the field, or bring them back to the HQ and count them later. So that's like low bar 10 minutes. So 10 minutes gives you 40 times 15 seconds, right? And let's say you have to move, and so let's say it take 30 seconds to do a Meli. So now in the time you do one wash, you could actually do 20 recording. So it sets the bar pretty low for Meli, because most commercial beekeeper will be generously between 5 and 10% of their yard when they're sampling. So let's take the optimistic one, like 10%. So remember, I just told you that you're sampling 10% of the colony. So you have maximum 10% of the mite. You detach 90% of that. So you're at 9%. And now you only sample 10% of your colony. So you're under 1%, like, of a chance to detect a mite. Just detect it. I'm not saying
Mhm.
finding a problem. While with Meli, let's say that Meli is it's not that, but let's say it was 50% of the performance of the wash. So rather than 9%, we're at, let's say, 5% if we round it up. So now if I go in the yard and I add up a 10%, let's say a yard of 40 hive. I sample 4 with alcohol wash. I get a 1% chance to detect a outbreak. I go to that same yard. I sample 20 in the same time I would have done. Actually, I can sample 40 here because I did 4 wash, so I have the time to sample the full yard. I sample 100% of the yard here, but I have only a 5% chance to detect, but it's actually 5 times better than your wash strategy. And the thing is that Meli is not 50% of today of the performance of the wash. And Meli will keep learning and improving, which the wash will not. The wash will never get better. And Meli will keep getting better the more people use it. And today, in the field performance, like we can detect about 8 times out of 10 hive that's over threshold.
So I just want to try to summarize just to make sure I got it correct. So we've got a scenario where you've entered a yard, there's 40 hives. In the alcohol wash model, we're talking about we're going to sample about 10%. So we're sampling 4 hives. That's 10 to 15 minutes of labor per hive, which adds up to about an hour. And what that gives us is only a 65% accuracy on 10% of the mites in a colony, because there's 10% of the mites are phoretic mites, 90% are in the brood. So what you're getting when you get a really good alcohol wash is 65% accuracy on 10% of the mites. What Meli does is, in the different scenario, is in that same hour of labor that you spent sampling those 4 hives, instead you were able to do, let's say, 20 hives, and you got an accuracy that was perhaps even better than what you would get with the alcohol wash. And now you've covered half of your hives as opposed to 4 of your hives. And so it's about 5 times better. Is that correct?
Yeah, exact. So the only little thing is like 65 to 90% on that 10%. So I took the up bar accuracy, you took the low bar, but yeah,
Right.
the same
So,
thing.
and that'll depend
Yeah.
a lot on the worker.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's highly, and the bees, they sample because, like, in theory, if you want to make sure it's nurse bees, you need to shake the bees in a bucket and then let the bee fly. And those bees are older bees, because the nurse bees have the tendency to just stay there. And then those bees are the one with the mites, right? Because the old bees don't have mite. Mites stay on the bees, but not until they become forager and everything.
Got it.
They're more on the nurse bees, the one that take care of the brood where the mites are.
Okay, so let's take that directly into something even more practical, which is around like treatment decisions. So there's sort of 2 points of view here. One is in the current method where you're sampling 10% of your hives, you're using an alcohol wash, you're not even considering Meli. I want to hear from you sort of one, where within Nectar you'd be able to find that information and how you would make those types of decisions. And then the other thing that I want to hear from you is, okay, now that we have Meli, let's say we're able to expand to 50%. How does that change the way that beekeepers should approach treatment decisions as a whole?
Yeah. So one thing is that in most cases, there's a blanket treatment approach where we'll just treat everything, not take the risk of not treating. Basically, is more what's happening. It's more we know the number one threat is mite. Like, why would I take the chance to not treat? But the thing about treatment is that it's really hard to know if you actually treat something if you don't check the efficacy. Because treatment is not about applying something. Treatment is about applying something that works. So you're treating, you're not just applying. And you have no way to know that if you don't sample. And we can see that. There's some growing resistance for amitrals. And that is partly due to that. Like you take a simple molecule which have a simple way of action. So simple way of action means that there's not a lot of genes that needs to mutate for it to become resistant. So, and then you just apply it massively, constantly, without checking the efficacy. So the resistance isn't really a problem if you sample, because you would have detected that your treatment didn't treat, it didn't work. The mite are resistant, so I need to do something else. And then you wouldn't have suffered the loss because you would have detect early the resistance. So it's really where if you could sample more, you could really change the way you treat, not only in the way you apply it to the hive. You could select hive and adjust the treatment maybe on a yard base, because maybe there's more hotspot and more high density of bees, and they get like more drift and stuff like that. But more importantly than reducing the treatment, you could know when your treatment works, and you could know if you need to do another round of treatment, or you could stop there. And now you would grow a confidence about, okay, I know that I did my treatment, and which is what we hear right now, but now you could add and follow up, and I know that my treatment worked. And that's what you could gain if you sample more. Yeah.
Yeah. So to summarize, there's sort of two main benefits. One is that if you're sampling across, again, to come back to this 40 hive yard, if you've got this 40 hive yard and you've sampled the entire yard because you've taken the same amount of time that you would have otherwise only done 4, you've now done the entire yard, and this specific hive has a huge breakout, rather than doing a blanket treatment across the entire yard because you're scared that if you don't treat, then you're going to run into issues. You can specifically target, I'm going to treat this one, and this one, because those are where the outbreaks are. And that is going to reduce the amount of time that you spend treating, and also make sure that it's more targeted and focused on the hives that need it most. But then what's the secondary benefit, and probably the longer term benefit, is that you're going to be in a position where you say, okay, I've treated these, let's say 4 or 5 hives, and then in 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now, I've done another round of sampling again because I have the time to do it. And that has showed me that the impact was this. And what that does is show you, one, the types of products that you should be using and their effectiveness. And two, it allows you to relate, let's say, genetic information or any type of other variable back to the treatment outcomes, which makes your decision making in the future that much more effective.
Yeah, exactly. So this is where, like before, I said you need an intent to collect data, but the benefit of collecting data is often that you get side benefit of it, and the huge benefit of traceability, like in farming, is that there's things you haven't thought yet. There's things you haven't seen yet, and if you track your queen in nectar, for example, or if you track your treatment, or if you track things like that, then you use Meli, then those things layer up. You can combine those value points and generate new value points that you haven't foreseen. So a lot of people track queens. So let's say queen. And often a lot of breeder will try to select queens for hygienic behavior or different behavior, maybe more producing honey, or things like that, or like more growth, more brood production. So if you use Meli and you track your queen, suddenly you can go inside and you can see the queen that grow faster, the queen that yield more for your bees. You can see the queen that have a lower mite count. And what we said before, you could reverse that logic too. So when we say you could sample a proportion of the population to get a good representation of it, but if you increase and you repeat something that has a small error, so like Meli is unperfect, it's a model, it's a predictive model. It will never be 100% perfect, perfect, perfect. So nothing is, and my eyes are not either. But like the thing is, when you repeat Meli, if you took the average per yard of mite, but you always have 100% sampling on all those, then the prediction becomes more powerful. Maybe one hive Meli completely misread on that yard, but Meli doesn't misread 39 hive out of 40. If it's happening, it's under 10% of the time. So if you take the average and you increase the robustness again of that value point, and then you can take even more decision with even more certainty without taking the risk of over relying on Meli and being hive specific. So it's where you can use those concepts.
So imagining a scenario where Meli is being used to sample 50%, 100%, what are the types of insights that you think beekeepers would be capable to start looking at?
Yeah. So optimizing treatment regime. So not only with what you treat, but when and how much you treat and what, like which hive you treat. So that's a big one because it's a lot of money we spend on treatment every year to treat those bees. Second is everything feeding, right? Because feeding, like, depends on the strength of the hive, and you feed more, a stronger hive. And feeding is a probably the biggest cost in beekeeping. Like it's a huge cost, and so if you could know with more accuracy the strength of your hive, and you could know like which yard are more strong, and go like that, and you could adjust your feeding, and you could actually save a lot of money, avoiding overfeeding and also avoiding underfeeding. So that's another big one. I think like queen lines and like selecting the queen that will have lower mite levels or faster growth, then you can really leverage that. And growth is a big one because if you can repeat Meli over time, you can start really see what the practice you do to your bees like bring positive change, because we tend to see things in a very static way of like this one is stronger than this one, but doesn't matter. What matters is this one became stronger. Like that's the important thing. So I think changing a bit that vision will lead a lot of benefit and a lot of like better businesses, better bees. And then there's an IPM program, which is kind of the obvious answer, which is like if I could have an integrated pest management within beekeeping and being specific at the hive level and start really treating what's needed to be treated, and have a good way to prevent catastrophic, like this is kind of the obvious one. So,
Yeah.
but a powerful one. So yeah.
Let's imagine a scenario where some Nectar customer listens to this podcast and says, "Oh my God, Nico, you've sold me. I believe in Meli. I think it's 100% the future. It's something I want to invest in. I'm going to change my behavior and start sampling at 100%." On a seasonal basis, how would they do that? And when would you start to see things start to change?
Yeah. So I think I'm an idealist, so I'll just go with what I think.
You're saying
Yeah.
idealist, right? Your French is coming through.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry. Anyway, so but yeah, so like ideally, I think you should do merely like every inspection. So like if you visit your hive every 14 days, for example, you would do it twice per month ish. The gain you would get to have a more accurate view of your operation in like in a very precise way. Like you could gain back that efficacy of investing, let's say, 10 minutes recording bees, like on a factor that's hard to measure today. Like because if you combine Meli with planning, for example, which is kind of like how we see it, then suddenly you can plan your visit way more accurately, and you can know what you need to do on which hive when. You can know the hive that need more attention, and you can start to challenge your visit pace, for example, because maybe if you were aware of the growth of your colony, if you and you knew that they were all double, and you knew that they're all 12, like in average 12 firm of bees there, then maybe I don't need to come back in 14 days. Maybe I have a bit more time, and maybe I can prioritize other yard that are way more tight in the schedule. So you can challenge everything about your schedule, and instead of doing rule based, start to do everything data driven based. And obviously, we're gonna keep working on tools to make that even easier in Nectar. But even today, like if you leverage well Meli and planning and insight, you can really get more organized in how you visit your bees and really more data driven. And as we said, then you can know like almost in real time, like not in real time, but after each visit, you can know if what you're doing is going in the right direction, because you'll have trends, you'll have change in time. And that's really something new maybe in the mind of a beekeeper, because often like we inspect, we may have some notes or something on the top of the hive to remind us of previous state, but it's we don't really have a mid-term view on the hive, like, a change. And that's really important. When you see that, like in my experience, when I see a hive like keep growing, at some point it stalls. Like it just stalls. And you look around, there's no pollen, there's nothing, there's no nectar. So, maybe it triggered a decision here. Like I need to actually put some pollen patty on, and I never thought of that. So there's a lot you could do if you increase your information. So if you have more information about the state of your hive and you combine that with logistic tool and BI tool, and then very soon predictive tool like survival prediction, then you can really change how you operate and optimize on longer term how your business is doing.
That's great.
Yeah.
So, what do you think is the biggest mistake that commercial operators are making around varroa management today?
My answer will be obvious, not sampling enough. Because think of it, like, so let's assume that mite is the number one threat in beekeeping, which is probably not too far from the reality, right? Until Tropile Labs comes by, maybe, but we'll see about that. So like, if you're taking the decision to manage your biggest risk, as I'm going to invest a minimal proportion of my time checking on that risk. Like, I don't want to spend too much time checking. I'm just going to assume that what I'm doing will maintain that risk low. But if you want to reduce your risk, you need to quantify it. Like, there's no way around it. Like, it's the only way. Like, if I invest in my money blindly in the stock market, then I I don't look at the company, like the background. I don't actually know what's their financial statement. I'm just like, it looks like it's good. I just invested it. Like, I'll probably have a very high risk. I may make money, but maybe not for a very long time. Well, if I gain information and I study those businesses and I start to take a decision with a lot of information, I reduced a lot of my risk. And might is really the same thing. Like, if I want to reduce the risk, I need to sample more. And then if I want to do my treatment work, I need to sample more. And then if I group my hive together in pollination event, which, for example, and I don't know if my treatment work, and my neighbor doesn't know if his treatment work, and we create those epicenter, like we densify for a very short term a crop to pollinate it, then everyone spread disease everywhere because it's like 100% certainty that at least one beekeeper didn't treat enough, because they don't sample enough, right? So, but why would you sample when your method like doesn't really work, right? You sample and like as a beekeeper, and maybe some scientific people will smash me on like on the head for this, but I know that alcohol wash doesn't provide me a reliable way to know my mite level. So I don't do it. Like, I'm a small scale guy, so I do sticky board. Like, it works well for me, but it's a lot of time. So
Brilliant.